So maybe we'll keep it short and head up there.
It actually looks a lot like my classes.
Yeah. But nonetheless, I think you'll find the audience tonight very interested in what you have to say tonight. But this is Paul Paskoff from LSU, Louisiana State University. Paul is a professor of American economics there, and your doctoral thesis was on Pennsylvania American charcoal industry. So he's very familiar with the steel industry, and in fact, we were talking about the project we did in 2000. Paul was interviewed for the Rebecca Lukens documentary in 2000, 2001, so he's famous there. But it's very interesting, and you may be able to give us a little bit more of the breadth of what you've covered in your history. Of course, we'd like to have your work here for researchers as well. But again, this is Paul Paskoff, and again, very interested tonight.
Thank you.
If I get the title correct, I know it's International Trade Associations, and the impact there. So we're very interested to hear. Again, welcome, Paul Paskoff. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know how those politicians say, I'm going to dispense with my prepared remarks? I don't dare. Actually, I will. I mean, this is not all of it, I promise. But I was saying to a couple of people here, I think, before we began, that when I was trying to turn my dissertation into a book, and you have to do that if you're going to get tenure at university, I decided I really didn't know very much more about iron making, charcoal iron making in particular, than what I'd learned in the archives and in the secondary sources and so on. And so what I decided to do was to build myself in my backyard a working scale model of a charcoal iron furnace. Well, even in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, there are zoning laws and neighbors who will complain. And my neighbor on one side, very nice fellow, reached his limits when it turned out that what I'd really built was a 6-foot-high smudge pot. And also I learned that you really need refractory brick. You can't just use the kind of brick, and the mortar, I learned how to lay brick a bit, but not very neatly. And the mortar, besides, when you heat it up to the temperatures I heated it up to, the mortar sort of just becomes frangible, it cracks, and well, anyway, smoke, lots of smoke. And it took a long time to put it out, more time than my wife really wanted to give me. But, well, I am delighted to be here. I last did serious work, concerted work on the iron and steel industry about 20 years ago. And I told myself then that that was it. I'm going to move on to other things. And then Sam wrote to me on behalf of Scott and asked if I'd be interested in talking about some aspect of the steel industry. And I discovered that your first love is always your last love, your longest love. And this really will never let me go. So I jumped at the chance, and so here I am. What I thought I would do today is try to give you what I could immodestly describe as the big picture, the American steel industry, between the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of World War I in 1914. So it's about a 50-year period, and it certainly means that it's a rather antiquated history. I mean, this United States steel industry of even post-World War I bore only a passing resemblance to what it had been before the war. Most aspects of American society, I suppose, would fit that description. But it's during this period between 1865 and 1914 that the foundations of what we generally call modern America emerged. If you consider that in 1865 there was a telegraph but no telephone. There were regional railroads, but there was no transcontinental railroad. The United States was probably, even after the destruction of the war, probably the third largest industrial producer in the world, but it was a distant third after Great Britain and France. The war that had just concluded in 1865 had been the largest and most destructive war in modern history up to that time, and not surprisingly, Great Britain, France, the German principalities, the Italian states, and so on, all sent military observers to look at what was happening on the battlefields in the Confederate Army and the Union Army. Curiously, they didn't really send observers to where the action was truly going on and what was probably responsible in large measure for the Union victory. They didn't send visitors to observe the iron and steel works in the United States. Had they done that, they would have seen a transformation underway that, beginning about 1865, once peace had resumed, turned the United States from a distant third into a real comer. And if I may, I could have called this this slide "How the Mighty Art Fallen," but it hurts too much to say that. So, if you'll look at this, is the top 5 steelmaking nations in 1902, which is the first full year of U.S. Steel's existence, United States Steel Corporation's existence, and 2006, the last full year before the economic crisis, our current crisis. So in 1902, the #1 ranked nation, this sounds like the Letterman show, I guess, but the #1 ranked nation was the United States with over 15 million metric tons of production, and the United States accounted for just under 42% of the world's total. In 2006, 104 years later, the United States is a very, very distant third. We now produce just under 99 million metric tons. China, however, is the world's leader, and it is the only nation of these 5 in which production actually increased from 2006 to 2007. It didn't, just for economy of presentation, I didn't think I should clutter the slide with, 2007. But you can see China with just under 423 million metric tons. And the closest competitor is Japan with just over 116 million metric tons. And then a rather distant third, the United States. What has happened, of course, is that the center of steelmaking activity has shifted. It has shifted not only from the United States, but really from Europe as well to Asia. And indeed, the fastest growing economies, we know the fastest growing economies in the world today are the Asian tigers, as they're called. And it's perhaps a coincidence, but I don't think it is, that as steel has gone, and as is going, so goes the economies. And in any event, that's what you might call the Newsweek magazine snapshot of past. I promise you there are only 2 of these sorts of things. The rest are photographs of people. But what you're looking at here is the output in terms of percentage of world output of the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States between 1870 and 1913. And the blue line is the United States. And as you can see, about 1874, the United States surpasses Germany. Germany is the green line. In about 1886, the United States surpasses Great Britain. In other words, the United States, 20 years roughly after the end of the American Civil War, the United States becomes the first steelmaking nation in the world. There has never been a transformation, an industrial transformation like this, until China's recent transformation. Food for thought there. And another aspect of the environment, the larger environment in which the steel industry of the United States developed, is one I know is familiar to all of you, and that is the substitution or the replacement of the Bessemer process for making steel by the open hearth process. There was a time when the open hearth process was the best practice technique. It was, in fact, the avant-garde technique, and the reason that there's this long, gradual increase, almost exponential, but nevertheless very gradual increase in the percentage of output accounted for by the open hearth process is that when you have a heavy investment, as most steelmaking firms did, in the Bessemer process, your only alternative in terms of shifting to open hearth is to scrap that Bessemer process. In fact, there was only one company that was in a position to do this in that period, and that was Carnegie Steel. And Carnegie much to the chagrin of his junior managers and his partners, many of whom he bought out because they refused to go along with his idea, decided, as he told his lieutenant, Charles M. Schwab, later of Bethlehem Steel, I want you to shut down production next year, and we are going to blow up all of the converters. That is, all the Bessemer converters. We will be out of production for 1 year, but we have a stockpile, and we will maintain prices. But we will be out of production for 1 year, and when we come back, we will be making steel with the open hearth process, and no one will be able to touch us. Well, Schwab didn't even dream of arguing with Mr. Carnegie, and yes, sir, and that's what they did. He kept the men, at least the skilled workers, on salary, discharged the rest, and when some of his partners balked and said that they wanted to be bought out, well, Carnegie showed them one of his sets of books. He kept two. One had the actual book value of the company, and the other was what might be called the publicly available book value, and that was what those partners could see, and it wasn't quite the full value of the corporation. He bought them out. Well, that's just a little bit of, I guess, business scandal. Fortunately, it doesn't happen anymore today. Well, anyway, you can see that about 1907, a year, as we'll see, a year fraught with significance. About 1907, these two lines cross. The decline of the Bessemer process intersects with the increase in the open hearth process.
I'm sorry, Paul. When did that happen?
Oh, that happened at about the 1880s. I was fudging because I can't remember exactly when it was, but the early 1880s, Carnegie said to Schwab, that's it. So you can see the intersection right there. 1907 is a year to remember. It was as I say, a year fraught with significance and peril. It was one of the worst short-term economic crises in American history. And fortunately, as I said earlier, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. So. Now, if the face isn't familiar, I know the name is. This is William McKinley. William McKinley, in 1890, was a congressman from Ohio. He would shortly become the political protege of an iron, steel, banking, and coal magnate from Ohio named Mark Hanna. McKinley, as a congressman, had a finely tuned ear to the needs of his constituents, some of whom were interested in going into a particular line of steel manufacture, tin plate manufacture. Now, most of the tin plate used to make flatware and so on, dinnerware, as well as some industrial uses, most of the tin plate came from two countries in 1890. It came from Britain and it came from Germany. And the British and German tin plate manufacturers did what many corporations and many nations did when they ran their mills to 100% capacity to maintain employment and achieve economies. They achieved a surplus that they could not sell at home or in nearby markets, and they dumped them. They dumped the surplus on foreign markets, selling it for less than the product would have sold for abroad. This was the basis for McKinley's insistence on a tariff to protect the iron and steel industry, particular parts of it, particularly the tin plate manufacturers, of whom there were almost none. What you need to bear in mind is that there were would-be tin plate manufacturers, people who said they would go into the line of tin plate manufacturing, provided they could get an even, a level playing field. That level playing field, of course, would be produced by a protective tariff. Now, the protective tariff, if we can take a giant step back, even before the Civil War, the protective tariff had been the dream of Alexander Hamilton, America's first Secretary of the Treasury. It was part of Hamilton's overarching economic program, which included, chartering a national bank, the first bank of the United States, and a national currency, assumption of state debts by the federal government, a perpetual sinking fund that is a national debt. But a key element of his economic program was a protective tariff to encourage the formation of American industry. The tariff, the protective tariff, was considered objectionable and even un-American. Rather, that is, it was considered British, mercantilist, by many of the people who had fought in the American Revolution and were now making up the American Congress. A tariff seemed to confer a particular advantage on one segment of the population and to the disadvantage of much of the rest of the population. In this case, the protective tariff on manufacturing, most of which was concentrated in New England, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. This is, after all, 1790, so a century earlier. Most of the manufacturing was concentrated there. The consumption, of course, was all over the country, but the vulnerable consumers would be those in the South. So even back then, in 1790, sectional economic interests reared their head. Well, it was a harder struggle to get a protective tariff than it was to get a national bank, and it was almost impossible to get a national bank, but Hamilton managed to do that. The War of 1812 and the upsurge in American nationalism, that the American victory, if it can be called that, when produced almost universal backing in the United States for a protective tariff. The Tariff of 1816, a year after the war's end, imposes rather high duties on imported wool, imported hemp, and imported iron. The idea was to give American industry a chance. The protective tariff sputtered along thereafter, but when Andrew Jackson became president, as you know, the tariff controversy loomed rather large. It almost provoked a secession crisis in 1832 and 1833. South Carolina's governor ordered the state militia to the state's borders, as he called it grandiloquently, and ordered the customs office in Charleston Harbor to stop collecting the United States tariff. Andrew Jackson went to Congress and sent a letter to Congress asking for authorization to fund and dispatch the United States Army, which he was intent on leading, into South Carolina to reopen the Customs House and compel obedience to the law. So you've got the governor of South Carolina and the president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, eyeball to eyeball. And to use that tired cliche, the governor of South Carolina starts to blink, and he doesn't stop blinking, and the Customs House reopens and so on. But the fact is, the reason that a clash was averted ultimately was because Jackson was willing to compromise, and he came out strongly in favor of a reduction in tariff rates. In 1832 and again in 1833, the tariff is lowered. Well, the tariff remained a perennial, almost a perennial controversial political issue right up until the Civil War. In 1857, without a protective tariff in force, when the panic of that year erupts and the American iron industry and the American woolens industry and cotton textile industry are languishing, unemployment is rising, there are soup kitchens and bread kitchens in northern American cities. By 1860, Illinois farmers are burning corn cobs for fuel because the price of corn is so low that they can't afford to bring it to market and sell it at a profit. Dairy farmers are milking their cows, because cows don't know about depressions, are milking their cows and dumping the milk in ditches because milk won't bear the cost of transportation. The economy is in such bad shape that petition after petition arrives in Congress asking for a protective tariff on, among other things, iron rails, woolen cloth, cotton textile cloth, a variety of agricultural products. The President of the United States at this point is James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. Now, Buchanan had gotten the Democratic Party's nomination in 1856, the same way his Democratic predecessor had gotten the nomination in 1852. That's Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. That is to say, the southern wing of the Democratic Party, which controlled the levers of power in the party, had said yes. But that meant that Buchanan was going to play ball. And on the matter of the tariff, Buchanan played ball. He refused these pleas for tariff protection, and so that's one of the reasons he became a one-term president. But in any case, advocates of the tariff insisted that the tariff would have induced recovery, and the effects of the panic would have been ameliorated, and prosperity would have returned. Instead, what brought prosperity back to the northern economy was, of course, the outbreak of the war. By 1861, the Depression that had begun in 1857 is more or less over. And the following year, in 1862, a series of tariff measures are launched, known as the Morrill Tariffs. The Morrill Tariffs raise rates to historic high levels, notably on iron and steel. So, the reason that Congress was able to impose these protective tariffs in 1862 was, of course, the southern states were out of Congress. They declared that they were out of the Union. When I teach this in Louisiana, you know, just to spare a lot of unpleasantness, you know, I say, yeah, when the South seceded, of course, Lincoln said the South did not secede, it had simply rebelled. Still a touchy subject down there, as you might imagine. So, well, without trying to, you know, make too fine a point out of it, with the South out of Congress, the Republican Party could cater to its constituents, who were chiefly those demanding the tariff protection, and so you get a series of protective tariffs. The protective tariffs, as well as war-induced demand, helped to stimulate the iron and especially the steel industry. The steel industry really got going in the United States shortly before the Civil War, but it began to go great guns during the war. And after the war, pent-up demand for new railroad construction was unleashed, and the new railroad tracks were being constructed not of iron rails, which had been the practice, but now the new and improved steel rails. And it's understandable why steel would have been preferred. The British steel mills were going full throttle, as that early graph suggested, going full throttle, and just as they had done with iron rails in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, they dumped steel rails on the American market. And so the demand for even higher tariff protection against British steel, that is foreign steel, but whenever I say foreign steel, you can read the word British there, the demand became intense, and by 1873, as the economy slid once more into an economic crisis, the so-called Panic of 1873, which triggers a 5-year-long depression, which produced all sorts of social upheaval, business failures, and so on. The tide of tariff protectionism, which had seemingly ebbed right after the Civil War, came storming back, and the demand for higher tariffs was renewed and catered to by Congress. But by about 1883, 1884, the demand for tariffs had once again ebbed, and tariff protection was reduced. Why? Because prosperity had returned to the economy. But by 1890, the economy was rather soft. It was beginning to soften up, and would-be tin plate manufacturers prevailed upon Congressman McKinley to offer his tariff. And the McKinley tariff is probably the only one on record in the long tariff history of the United States that actually may have, and I say may have, actually encouraged the formation or the flourishing of the industry it was designed to protect. Now, I know that may sound like an absurd statement, absurd on two counts. One, it seems so improbable that it could have been the only one, and second, that I can't even say that it was successful. But that's just the nature of the historical record, a bit ambiguous. In any case, the McKinley tariff was very popular with would-be tin plate manufacturers, and they began to go into the industry. And within 10 years, that is by 1900, American tin plate steel manufacturers not only didn't need tariff protection from British and German tin plate steel makers, but British and German tin plate steel makers needed protection in their own home markets from the American competition. So this is, if it's not a successful tariff, it's the heck of a coincidence. In any case, as popular as the McKinley tariff was with the iron and steel makers, it was not very popular with constituents of other congressmen around the country, congressmen who had voted for it, and it was probably not very popular with most of McKinley's constituents because he was voted out of office. He was thrown out of office. He thought his political career was over. Enter Mark Hanna to sort of take him in hand and show him that he was destined for greater things, as we know. Incidentally, McKinley is the last president who was a veteran of the Civil War. His opponents derided him, saying all he did was pour coffee for the Army of the Potomac at Antietam. Well, that was, a canard, but in any case, he was the last Civil War veteran to serve as president. And when he becomes president in 1896, it's at the head of the Republican Party, a party that comes storming back to political power primarily because the Democratic Party is discredited in large measure because of the Depression that began in 1893, full blast, and was still going on in 1896 when the voters went to the polls. Of course, the Democratic presidents who had preceded McKinley had insisted that the nation did not need tariff protection and that the iron and steel industry did not need tariff protection. I can't speak for other industries. I don't know, for example, if the American textile industry, broadly defined, cotton, woolens, and so on, continued to need tariff protection in the 1890s. I don't know if the American lumber industry needed it, and so on. I do know that the American iron and steel industry did not need it. By 1890, in fact, the American iron and steel industry was a rip-roaring success. Whether the protective tariffs of earlier years had helped to make it so is something that is beyond my ability to determine. You'd probably have to be a cliometrician, and even then, wielding statistics and econometrics and applying it to historical data. And even then, you probably couldn't get 3 historians to agree that you're right. In any case, by 1901, when U.S. Steel is formed, we have a very interesting situation. The American steel industry, by 1901, is the largest steel industry in the world, as you saw. 1902, the first full year of U.S. Steel's existence, the American steel industry dominates, and that corporation dominates steelmaking around the world. And yet, the American Iron and Steel Association, made up of large and small steel makers alike, the American Iron and Steel Association in 1901 and 1902 is waging as strenuous a battle for continued tariff protection for iron and steel in 1902 as they had in 1882 and 1872. And the question is why? And I have some excerpts from, you might call these Paskoff's greatest hits, perhaps, but some excerpts from the hearings in which the leaders of the American iron and steel industry were interrogated by congressional committees. Incidentally, the Charles Lukens Houston Sr. and Abram Francis Houston of the Lukens Iron and Steel Company were not interrogated. And I'd like to think, and I'll flatter my host, I'd like to think that it's because they had the sense not to go. Nobody was subpoenaed, I mean, and it makes you wonder why Charles Schwab and Andrew Carnegie and Elbert Gary, the president of U.S. Steel, went. I can't really explain it. In any event, when Schwab, here we go. Schwab appeared on December 15, 1908, before the House Ways and Means Committee on the question of revising the tariff. Now, the tariff was up for one of its biennial revisions. They were either going to, and by tariff revision, they meant they were either going to raise it or lower it, but by then they were probably going to lower it, or at best, from the point of view of those who wanted tariff protection, keep it the same. Schwab appears on December 15, 1908, before the Ways and Means Committee, and he encounters a good deal of skepticism, even hostility, and he's not accustomed to that. He is one of the big men of steel. He's president of Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He is the second most powerful steel maker and he embodies his corporation, second most powerful steelmaker in the United States, which means he's the second most powerful steelmaker in the world. And he is not accustomed to being talked to the way he is about to be talked to. A member of the committee poses a question to him to which there is no simple answer, and a question to which no congressman in his right mind would have expected Schwab to answer in any way that might be even slightly satisfactory to the congressman. The congressman, having already been interrupted by Schwab and having interrupted Schwab several times as Schwab tried to answer earlier questions, the congressman is kind of heated at this point. I wish there were a videotape of this, because I don't think they make hearings like this anymore. The congressman says, "Let me finish my question," to Schwab. "And the great corporations," you tell me if you can see a question in this, "and the great corporations are so blended and dovetailed and interwoven together that they, pursuing their various functions, controlling their various interests, combine and plunder the common people?" Okay, I gave it away. There's actually a question mark in the middle of that. When I say plunder, I mean by charging a higher price than they could without such combination. At this point, other members of the committee jumped in and they demand of Schwab, "Answer yes or no, answer yes or no." All they want is a yes or no. Schwab gets exasperated. He gets red in the face, he gets exasperated, and he replies, and he throws up his hands. He said, "I give up. I do not even understand the question." And he waits to be excused. Now, such moments have not been rare in the long, tortured history of congressional committee hearings, but this one, I think, is just about priceless. And to a certain degree, Schwab had encouraged the committee's hostility by his blithe dismissal of the possibility of any collusion among major steel producers to fix the price of steel rails at $28 a ton. It had been $28 a ton for more than 10 years by then. $28 a ton. And when they asked him, wasn't this done by collaboration, consultation, collusion, all those C words, and some of them are less flattering than others, wasn't this the result? Nope, not at all. So one of them asks him, well, how does it come about that steel rails, at this point, have for the last 5 years remained at $28 per gross ton without any collusion with anybody else? Schwab's reply, I would say, was disingenuous, possibly to the point of barefaced lying, but you be the judge. He may actually have believed what he said. But in any case, he assured the committee that the remarkable price stability of steel rails was due to the fact that the $28 per ton price, quote, seems to have been recognized by all rail manufacturers as a fair price and one giving a fair profit, unquote, and that any unilateral price reduction would trigger a steel war that would ruin all rail makers. When the congressman pressed him to say whether he really believed that, quote, absolute uniformity for the last few years in price of steel rails at $28 is without agreement, he replied blithely, by now his face had lost its red hue, he replied blithely, absolutely. And then he folded his hands. Well, Schwab was similarly certain and unbending when the committee asked him whether American steel producers could operate successfully without a tariff. Yes, sir, he replied. My view of it is this. You can take the tariff off altogether if you want to, and we will be able to compete anywhere, but we have to put the conditions in a similar form. We have to put labor on a similar basis. Now, in other words, what he told the committee was that if the tariff were reduced, steel companies would have to cut their workers' wages to bring them down to levels comparable to the wages paid by British and German steel firms. Now, this was the traditional argument of the American Iron and Steel Association's membership. They had made it, they had trotted it out for, by then, 40 years. And to have it trotted out in late 1908 by someone like Charles M. Schwab, who one would like to think certainly knew better, and whose corporation enjoyed a cost structure and a rate of return on investment that made a tariff a matter of little consequence, if any at all, makes one wonder what he was doing. And I asked myself that because I'm not a very good student of human nature, and I wouldn't presume to be able to divine what Charles M. Schwab's motives were. So this is what I can say with at least within my comfort zone about this, that the answer to how somebody like Schwab could say that in late 1908 was that after 30 years involvement in the steel industry, first at Carnegie Steel, then with U.S. Steel, and then most recently as head of Bethlehem Steel Corporation, he still saw the tariff, the protective tariff issue, in the same terms by which he had first come to understand it. And it had made sense 30 years before, it had made sense 10 years later, and although by 1890 the situation had dramatically changed, he still saw it in those terms. He wouldn't be the last person who found comfort in a settled idea. I'm probably even guilty of that as well. Feel free to disagree. But in any case, when the committee questioned, I realize I've deprived you of these faces. Let me, yeah, of course. Let me, I'll go back. Some of these people, there they are. There he is. Would he lie? Look at that face. Butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Elbert H. Gary, as you undoubtedly know, was the president of U.S. Steel. And if Schwab was kind of bluff and even arrogant and combative in his replies to the committee, Gary was the opposite. Gary was the diplomatist. Schwab had come up on the steel floor. He was tough. He didn't suffer fools at all. Gary suffered them gladly if he could get what he wanted. And when the committee questioned Judge Gary, 3 days after they had finished with Schwab, he also gave them arguments in favor of a protective tariff. But it quickly became evident that Gary had some remarkable views concerning the ultimate value of protection. When a congressman asked him if he believed that the, quote, that the iron manufacturers cannot control the American market without the help of the tariff, he replied with considerable understatement that, and I'm quoting, the United States Steel Corporation would endeavor to take care of itself. But I think that many, if not most, of our competitors would soon be out of business, and we would have the field, unquote. Well, this prompted the logical next question. I mean, ask yourself, if you were sitting at that congressional dais and the president, the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel said that, yeah, take away the tariff, we'd survive, but our smaller competitors would perish, wouldn't this be the next logical question? Then from a selfish standpoint, asked the congressman, wouldn't it be in the interest of United States Steel to take the tariff off? Well, in his answer to that question, Gary demonstrated the qualities of mind that made him not merely a powerful steel man, but an industrial statesman as well. This is what he said to the congressman. You might think so, but I do not think so. I think it would be the worst thing that could happen to United States Steel, because the people would not stand it. We do not want those conditions. And instead of trying to bring about such conditions as that, we have done what we could, fairly and justly, to prevent it and to assist our competitors. You can understand the incredulity of the members of Congress. They assumed he was lying. I mean, Schwab had obviously conned them about, they felt, about the $28 a ton price for steel rails. And now there's Gary, who's just dissembling before them. Oh, I wouldn't hurt a fly. We want to keep our competitors in business. Does that make good business sense? Well, it wouldn't have made good business sense in 1890. Well, 1889. In 1890, it began to make good business sense because of the passage of a piece of legislation called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And even under McKinley, from 1897 to mid-1901, when he was assassinated, it probably would not have made sense to say, as Gary did, that U.S. Steel is worried about its competitors. But once Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, worrying about one's competitors when you are the largest manufacturer or producer of a product does make sense. Gary had said essentially the same thing on earlier and less public occasions at his celebrated Gary dinners. They weren't named for the venue, Gary, Indiana. They were named because Gary was always the host. And he held these in 1907 and 1908. And there, at these dinners, where he invited competitors, large and small, but they were all smaller than U.S. Steel, of course, he had advanced the idea of what he was pleased to call cooperative competition. Does that sound like an oxymoron? Cooperative competition. By which he meant that U.S. Steel and other major steel firms would agree not to engage in destructive price cutting to undermine one another. In other words, no rate wars, no price wars. Nobody thought Gary would benefit from that. Well, of course, in the short run, U.S. Steel would benefit. Bethlehem Steel would benefit. Quite frankly, Lukens would benefit from it. But there were scores of smaller competitors that would have perished. The restraint that Gary was urging and was assuring his competitors that U.S. Steel would exercise would assure U.S. Steel of a rationalized competitive environment that would provide the corporation with a shield against an antitrust suit to which his corporation, he knew, was very, very vulnerable, especially in 1907 and 1908. Why? Because in 1907, United States Steel Corporation absorbed, took over, engulfed the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Corporation. With the approval, or at least the tacit approval, the acquiescence of the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who viewed U.S. Steel, as was his rather peculiar habit of distinguishing among trusts, as a good trust. American Tobacco was a bad trust. Standard Oil was a bad trust. U.S. Steel's a good trust. A good trust is a trust whose operations serve the public interest. A bad trust is one whose operations harm the public interest. So, by taking over Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad, a merger whose effects were going to long outlast the Roosevelt presidency, Gary knew that the corporation, U.S. Steel, was potentially vulnerable to an antitrust suit. Well, the sort of self-restraint, however self-interested, practiced by U.S. Steel required a safety valve. If U.S. Steel is not going to flood the domestic market with lower-priced steel and sell all that U.S. Steel can produce, that surplus production has to go somewhere. And beginning in 1903, under Gary's guidance, U.S. Steel founded the United States Steel Export Company, set up specifically to siphon off excess capacity and send it abroad. Latin America, Asia, and Europe, including Britain and Germany. You can imagine the satisfaction of some old steelmen when they learned that United States Steel was going to start dumping steel on Germany and Great Britain. Well, the sharp tone of the exchanges between the congressmen and the steel magnates, Schwab and then Gary, was in 1907 and 1908, 1909, was due in large part to the belief by many committee members, and presumably by their constituents who were writing letters and sending telegrams, that an industry that could sell steel abroad at a lower price, that's what dumping is, could sell steel abroad at a lower price than at home and still make a profit, did not need tariff protection from foreign competition. I mean, I think you'd have to be able to square a circle to believe otherwise. This point came up repeatedly during the hearings, and both Gary and Schwab attempted to diffuse that point when each one testified. Schwab explained, for example, that American steel firms did not encounter competition from foreign producers of steel rails in this country because, and he said this with a straight face, so this guy is somebody to be reckoned with, because, quote, buyers of rails in this country want to get their rails from the people who patronize their railroads, even if it meant paying a bit more than the price of foreign rails. Well, maybe. He went on to say that American rail producers met foreign competition in peripheral markets, quote, in countries where we, that is, American and foreign rail producers, have a mutual field of competition. South America, Siberia, or similar countries. And if I were doing this in print, I would write SIC, meaning Siberia is not a country and neither is South America. But Charles M. Schwab isn't an English professor. He's a powerful steelman. Judge Gary, for his part, had tried to explain how and why American steel producers sold some of their products in foreign markets for less than they sold them in the United States. The question had come up, as it when other men had testified, when a congressman had asked him to account for the flurry of steel exports to the United States from Germany. And Gary said that the German steelmakers were not doing anything unusual or unethical. Quote, when business is dull at home, they do in Germany what we do here. To keep their mills running and the men employed, they dump the surplus. The portrayal of the export policy of U.S. steel as a seemingly expedient tactic rather than a carefully planned and executed strategy was probably politically wise, but it was at best a half-truth. Well, the involvement of U.S. Steel in foreign markets was a part of the U.S. Steel Corporation's plan for operating in a domestic market where cooperative competition prevailed in key product lines. When the House Ways and Means Committee questioned its last important witness, there he is. Now, that's a man who's never told a lie, much less kept 2 sets of books. When the House Ways and Means Committee questioned its last important witness during the December 1908 session, it heard a blunt and sometimes querulous interpretation of the tariff's historical and current significance for the steel industry. The witness was Andrew Carnegie, then 73 years old, retired from the steel business, and something of a legend, even considered a national treasure. The congressman who had so often spoken sharply to the other witnesses, Charles M. Schwab and Judge Gary included, adopted an almost solicitous, even oleaginous tone when they questioned Carnegie. Because of his answers to their questions, the exchanges between Carnegie and some of the committee's members made for some of the liveliest and humorous moments in the protracted hearings. I did not, however, select the humorous excerpts. When a congressman asked him to explain, quote, just what benefit the tariff was to you in starting the manufacture of steel rails, he replied, did I not explain that? I explained that I would not have started at all without the considerable advantage of the tariff. Well, the congressman wasn't smart enough to lay off at that point, and he persisted, asking, then the tariff was an insurance for you. Losing patience, Carnegie said, I have just told you that it was the only insurance. I would not have gone in without it. Well, Carnegie was referring to the years 1869 and 1870 when he had begun to produce Bessemer rails in Pennsylvania under the protectionist umbrella of the rates available under the post-Civil War tariffs. But his view of the tariff had since changed. Once it had been necessary to enable young American concerns such as his own to survive in the face of foreign competition. But that was no longer the case. He said, quote, my opinion is that the American steel industry is on such a foundation that even if the tariff were taken off, I do not think that any foreign steel rails or steel of any kind would come in here to any extent, gentlemen, now. Well, the committee heard other witnesses after Carnegie, and in the end, the bill that emerged from its deliberations went to the new president, the new president, William Howard Taft. And the legislation that went to him was the known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff after its 2 sponsors, and I don't know how to get back, so let me just, Representatives Sereno E. Payne and Senator Nelson W. Aldrich. This tariff act kept the steel products on the protected list, but at substantially reduced rates. This is the last hurrah of protectionism for steel in this country. For all practical purposes, the battle over the tariff was over, although the last salvo was not fired until 1913 when the Underwood-Simmons tariff of that year was passed. And the Underwood-Simmons tariff removed iron ore, pig iron, and steel rails from the protected list, put them on the free list, and slashed all other steel rates. Now that meant that a large amount of income that had been pouring into the U.S. Treasury was gone. And there had to be a way of offsetting that loss. And fortunately, a rider to the Underwood-Simmons tariff of 1913 included a graduated federal income tax. And that's the origin of that particular thing. So every April 15th, you can thank the Underwood-Simmons tariff for giving you graduated federal income taxation. Well, the irony, just to wrap up, the irony to this protracted struggle over tariff protection for steel was really twofold. In the first place, opponents of protection during the 1890s and early 1900s were surely mistaken in their view that the tariff had fostered monopoly. At most, one could fairly have said that after 1901, it temporarily shielded U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, from the unwanted attentions of the Justice Department's increasingly energetic antitrust lawyers by keeping in business the smaller competitors. The other ironic aspect to the victory of the anti-protectionists, however, lay in the very timing of their triumph. Long before their legislative victory over the protectionists, the steel industry's material and organizational development had enabled its most important segments and firms to fend off foreign competition without a tariff. So coming when it did, the removal of tariff protection for steel mattered very little, if at all. The steel industry had needed protection in the years before 1880, perhaps as late as 1890, and it had fought hard to get it from Congress. But after 1890, because of the industry's continuing technological advances and organizational change, and because of a favorable geography of production, it could have readily dispensed with the tariff. And doing so almost certainly would have improved the industry's political standing at home. The refusal or inability of leading steel firms to take that step, such as Bethlehem Steel's refusal, was, as we've seen, the result of many considerations, including ideological inertia. But in the end, it proved not to matter much at all. The steel industry had transformed itself, and in the course of doing so, had become suited to a new American political economy of big business and big government that the very growth of the steel industry had helped to bring about in the first place. Thank you. I'll take any questions if you like.
Well, I was curious about one point you made. You said that the history of the tariffs from 1790 on, that really had made very little impact on the industries that they were intended to target.
Yeah.
I mean,
I know that sounds counterintuitive.
So was the primary objective of tariffs revenue, as opposed to actual industrial protection?
That's a really well-framed question too. I wish I'd thought of it. There were always two types of tariffs. You know, as I'm sure you know, there was the revenue tariff, and that was a tariff of relatively nominal levels. Anything under 20% was generally considered, a 20% rate was generally considered essentially a revenue tariff. Anything that 20% or lower really wasn't going to afford very much protection, especially because foreign producers could dump their goods and sell at 20% less than at home, and therefore overcome a 20% tariff. All protective tariffs were necessarily revenue tariffs, and they generated more revenue. All revenue tariffs, of course, were not, protective tariffs. There were three issues that threatened to disrupt the federal union prior to 1861. One, of course, was slavery, and that did it. Another was, of all things, public works, internal improvements. And the third was the protective tariff. And the protective tariff and internal improvements were linked together. The suspicion in southern states was that a protective tariff gave the federal government so much surplus revenue that it would work its mischief by projecting its power through in the form of canals and roads and turnpikes and even railroads and river improvements. So you wanted to starve the beast. That's a 21st century expression, I guess, maybe a late 20th century one. You want to starve the beast, that is the federal government, went the reasoning, and you do that by cutting off its food supply, that is revenue. So you keep it at the level necessary to run the post office, the Army, the Navy, the consulates, and so on, and pay Congress, of course, and the executive branch and the federal judiciary, and that's it. One Southern statesman in the 1790s, Nathaniel Macon, advised his younger colleagues from the South to oppose Washington's proposal, and all it was at this point was a proposal for not only a national road, but also a canal. It's going to be like the Chesapeake-Potomac Canal. And when they asked him why, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, that federal government that can project and complete a canal can more readily emancipate the slaves. So in other words, money was power even then, and you want to keep that power constrained. So, in 1832 and 33, there was a crisis of union with South Carolina threatening to go it alone. In 1846, you had Southern congressmen like Yancey of Alabama getting up and saying, If this River and Harbors bill is not crushed, is not killed, is not withdrawn, or at least not vetoed and the veto upheld, then the South will leave the Union. And he is echoed by another congressman from Mississippi. His name is Jefferson Davis. So those two issues, you know, they were seen as two sides of the same coin. Those two issues threatened to disrupt the government. By 1850, they had sort of receded, and as you know, as I said, when American iron producers were screaming for tariff protection after 1857, even a Pennsylvania-born president, James Buchanan, who knew he owed his office really to the influence of Southern Democrats, hewed the line. So it may have been an overstatement by me, but I'm simply reflecting, you know, the accepted wisdom, which, you know, decide what it's worth. I've never had a lot of confidence in it, but the accepted general wisdom among American economic historians and economists that tariffs have generally been unavailing of their ultimate object, which was the protection of industry. That the real protection comes from technological advance. The fact that the technological advances occur while the industry is being protected by the tariff, as well as when it's not being protected, sort of supports that view. But the McKinley tariff is maybe the only exception.
I mean, yes, tariffs are unbelievably hard, complex. I mean, they're designed for barriers to entry to be reduced so that a Carnegie can get into business. But ultimately, the economic model then is inefficient. And if the market forces are trying to become the most efficient they can, and ultimately the tariff becomes a barrier to an efficient market. How, you know?
Well, you know, the efficient market idea, you know, and presumably that, you know, prices contain all the necessary information you need in order to make sense of, you know, supply and demand. The efficient market model hasn't enjoyed a lot of good press the last couple of years, but, you know, no doubt it'll enjoy a renaissance at some point, you know, when unemployment drops.
Well, I guess that's what's interesting. The tariff is unilateral and helps everybody, you know, whereas Carnegie, you know.
Oh, I see.
You know, I guess where there's no option for, I mean, I guess you can design something for a small mom and pop rather than the large corporations are trying to do to help reduce, you know, get that competitive, get the marketplace going at an incubator stage so that you can create more, reducing barriers to entry.
Well, yeah, like the tin plate, you know, the McKinley tariff, which, you know, essentially discouraged the importation of German and British tin plate steel. And what that meant was that American producers didn't always have to be looking over their shoulders. Sort of the Butch Cassidy, you know, and Sundance Kid thing. You remember how Butch Cassidy keeps looking back over his shoulder? Who is that guy? You know, when he's being chased. Well, that's essentially, I guess, the position that American tin plate steel makers would have found themselves in without the tariff. Now, there's a fairly good argument that's been made. I don't know that I subscribe wholly to it, but it does make me question my reasoning a bit, that the greatest increases in tin plate steel production in the United States came after the McKinley tariff had been removed, under non-protective tariffs. The problem is, you know, you can't run a controlled experiment on the past. So the fact is, in those first 5 to 10 years when the McKinley tariff was in force and its effects were being felt, that's when the tin plate steel industry, you know, put down its roots, developed its customer base, expanded its physical plant, perfected its management, and so on, and was perhaps ready to face an unprotected environment. And indeed, you know, by 1900, the need for protection has shifted from America to Europe. It's one of the great ironies. So I don't know that I buy the argument that even the McKinley tariff was unsuccessful. I think that might be the only successful one. But again, you know, you can't run the controlled experiment, so we can't hold the tariff constant and, or, you know, we can't nullify the tariff and just have technological change. And then you know, the tariff was in force through much of our history, but at differing rates. Now, I just want to mentioned something. There was a picture of J.P. Morgan, you know, on there, and it had Morganizer on there. And I don't want you to think that I was being clever. Somebody else had been clever, and I was copying it. J.P. Morgan's way of rationalizing the national business environment was to take competing firms that were tearing one another apart, or at least operating at below optimal level, and reorganize them. And the process became known in the press as Morganization. It was said that Mr. Morgan was taking the railroad industry in hand. He had. And Mr. Morgan was taking the steel industry in hand. He had. He was the midwife to the birth of U.S. Steel in February of 1901. So that's why they call him, you know, the Morganizer. So just a little tidbit.
Remorganizing, huh?
Remorganizing, right. Yes?
You're talking about Andrew Jackson and the bank, the federal bank. Many historians, financial historians, blame him when he refused to renew the charter of the second bank, which of course is headquartered in Philadelphia, for the fact that for many years we had no central banking system. We have letters of Rebecca Lukens complaining that not sure if a check written here would be good in Lancaster or Harrisburg. But if I remember correctly, wasn't this tied in with the tariffs? The tariffs were collected, and as New York outgrew Philadelphia, the feeling was that all this money was coming to Philadelphia and not to New York. And I understand, I don't know if it's correct or not, but that was part of the agitation for getting rid of the bank because of the collection of tariffs.
Well, now it may have been. I'm not familiar with that possibility. I do know that the real, you know, the first major turning point in the commercial rivalry between Philadelphia and New York was the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825, and that really shifted the axis of trade. And by 1832, I think New York had become the major clearinghouse for commercial paper, even without the even with the central bank, you know, because the bank, of course, had branches in every major commercial city. And in fact, one of the complaints about the national bank, the second bank of the United States, was that its branches were like the arms of an octopus. You know, in other words, the head of the octopus was in Philadelphia, and the tentacles went out to, you know, New York, Savannah, Charleston, and so on, New Orleans, and that therefore the second bank of the United States could compete with an unfair advantage for the loan market of South Carolina, Georgia, and so on. I think one would say that most sound money men, I guess that's what they would be called, that's something of an anachronism in this period, but most sound money men favored the bank. Most merchants favored the bank, most manufacturers, for obvious reasons. As you know, you say, Rebecca Lukens wondering whether a check would be good. But the fact is, even in the absence of a national bank, the economy expanded. So the fact is, might it have grown at a faster rate? Might it have been more centralized earlier? Might there have been, therefore, greater sources of concentrated capital, which might have brought about big business at an earlier stage? That I don't know. I still blame Andrew Jackson for the Panic of 1837 and the Depression of 1839, but I'm actually in a minority among economic historians. Ever since Peter Temin of MIT wrote this wonderful little book called The Jacksonian Economy, in which he essentially acquits Andrew Jackson and the bank war of responsibility for the Panic of 1837 and the ensuing Depression, you know, the burden in the argument has been on people like me, voices crying in the wilderness.
One last thing, Paul, is Rebecca, I think, she favored, and Gene, you can help me out, she backed tariffs once in her life. 1844 was there.
I think she did, yeah. She fought for tariffs.
He didn't win. That's the last we heard of her in the tariff world. But she was only in business for another 10 years.
Right. Well, you know, I've been remiss in not pointing out a historical division within the iron and steel industry on the tariff question, because I've perhaps given the impression that the industry spoke with one voice, and it really didn't. Since there are branches of the industry, there are the primary producers who are producing you know, ingots and rails and so on, and then there are the secondary producers who are manufacturing hardware or, you know, products derived from the primary products. the secondary manufacturers oftentimes didn't care where that steel or iron was coming from. If it came from abroad and it was of a good quality and a lower price, fine. You know, you can make a garden tool or an industrial tool out of imported steel just as readily as you can from American steel. So within the steel industry, the main center of support for a high protective tariff was always to be found among the primary producers, the integrated firms, the firms that were producing pig iron and cast iron and later steel. And the opponents included, among others, the largest consumer of steel, first iron and then steel, single consumer, and that was the American railroad industry. American railroad firms in the 1830s and 40s had a decided preference for British rails, iron rails. Now, the British were cheating. They would mark their rails as premium and would sell them at below premium prices so that American railroad corporations thought they were getting a price break. And actually, the American rails, which American railroad corporations were spurning, preferring the cachet of getting prime British rails, the American rails were actually of superior quality, oftentimes. But because the British mislabeled their rails, that is, they misstated their quality, American rail corporations began to favor them. Now, when the rolling mill capacity of the American iron industry finally caught up with the British, and that was about 1854, American iron rail producers could turn out rails at a price that was lower than anything the British could match, and that marks the shift to a preference for iron rails. But after about 1865, 1866, so the loudest cheerleader for a protective tariff on iron and steel, the loudest voice among the cheerleaders is that of the railroad industry. And part of that is because of the interlocking directorates of the big iron and steel corporations on the one hand and the big railroad corporations on the other. I mean, a mutuality of interest. So, well, if there's nothing else, thanks.
Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, anybody have anything else? Well, great. Well, thank you, Paul, very much.